A new FBI report finds that the war on cops is real and has deadly consequences. We'll interview an expert on this special edition of The Hot Zone.
This is The Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
It seems like these days, anytime a cop has to shoot someone in the course of his job, whether it's justified or not, in self-defense or not, there are almost invariably protests and sometimes even riots in response. Around the nation, city leaders seem more inclined to throw law enforcement under the bus than to stand behind them when things go sideways. This has led to a trend they call depolicing, where cops are deciding it's simply not worth it to enforce the law if they'll be punished for doing so. Today, we'll talk to an expert in the field of policing, author and writer for Police One, my friend, Mike Wood. All right, Mike Wood, good to see you, my friend.
Nice to see you, Chuck.
Yeah, it's been a little while. Talk to me a little bit about the current state of affairs with de-escalation training and the whole idea behind depolicing.
Well, as we've seen here since the Ferguson incident, we've seen a significant amount of changes in our police culture. We've seen a lot of officers voluntarily making less contacts with the public as a way to try to protect themselves from the liability that they see. And so it's had a major effect on community policing in communities throughout our nation. We've seen the really drastic effects in places like Baltimore, for example, with some very, very significant increases in the murder rate and other violent crimes as a result of officers voluntarily pulling back from discretionary policing.
Now, you had an interesting article in Police One the other day about the kind of the dangers behind de-escalation training, because, you know, in policing now in the United States, it's all about de-escalation. And you were saying that actually can put people at greater risk, not only the police, but the public at large. How so?
Absolutely. In policing, there's a concept that talks about the priorities of life, and otherwise known as the safety priorities in some circles. And those priorities establish the list of priorities that officers need to keep in mind when they're trying to ensure public safety. And that safety begins with making sure that we take care of the innocent victim, number one. And then we also have to worry about innocent bystanders at the scene. We also have to worry about police officers and their safety at the scene, and also the safety of the suspect that's involved. And what's happened with the depolicing effort and the de-escalation emphasis that we're seeing in law enforcement culture right now is it's flipped that priority system on its head, where instead of placing the safety of the innocent life, the innocent citizen, at the forefront of our thoughts, officers are now being forced to worry more about the safety of the suspect. And so what we see are some very unfortunate incidents, like a recent one that we had in Los Angeles where a man took a woman hostage, and the officers were so concerned about not using force against that man that they unfortunately let the situation degenerate to the point where they had to now make a hostage rescue shot to try to save the innocent life. And unfortunately, they hit the hostage and killed the hostage as a result. And
killed the man as well.
They also killed the suspect as well.
But from reading your article about that, it sounds like they had plenty of opportunities to stop that guy, and he was an imminent threat before he took the hostage, and they could have stopped him before he got to the hostage, but because they were reluctant to use force, they let it, like you say, degenerate to the point where they ended up killing both of them.
That's exactly what happened. There were plenty of opportunities and legal standing for them to use force early in the event, but because of the increased emphasis on de-escalation, particularly within that department and the politics that surround it in the Los Angeles area, those officers got to the point that they let the situation delay too long, and they didn't use that force early when they could have, when they were morally and legally justified to do so. And in the end, it wound up costing the life of the hostage.
Well, that's really unfortunate, and it actually brings up the stuff that we've been seeing in Broward County ever since the shooting at Parkland, and that there was a court case, if I'm not mistaken, just recently where the judge ruled that the police do not have a responsibility to keep the children safe while they're in school, even the school resource officer who's being paid to do just that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we've seen this at the Supreme Court level for decades now. If we go back into the 1970s, I think is when we had our first Supreme Court precedent regarding that, where the officers do not have a legal obligation to provide safety or security or protection to any one individual, but rather just to the public at large. So that's an established part of constitutional law, that the police do not have a responsibility to protect you as an individual citizen. And we're just seeing that same play get rewritten here with the new context here in the Broward incident. And it's unfortunate that that's the situation there. And from the perspective of the public thinking that the police are there to protect them as individuals, they would think that's an unfortunate turn of events. But honestly, it's the only way that the system can really work.
Yeah,
the
but
police
I think that it might give a whole new angle to the idea behind, like, let's say, gun-free zones, where you have a place where you're intentionally making the public more vulnerable because you're not allowing them to bring the tools they need to protect themselves. But now you're saying also that the police are not going to protect you either. So you're just completely unprotected.
Right. There's a jeopardy that gets created when we have those things like gun-free zones, which is the reason why people like you and I argue against them, and why we also advocate for everybody to be responsible for their own safety, because in the end, that's really what it comes down to.
So again, I got a lot of hate from the internet about saying that people should attack the attacker, that should be the default setting, because it's honorable to put yourself at risk for the benefit of others, but it's also smart because you're taking the choice between pretty much certain death through execution and possible death through attacking the attacker. It's the best of two terrible situations for sure, but how do you feel about that line of reasoning?
Well, I don't argue against it. What I will say is that every situation has its own unique circumstances, and so you have to make a judgment based on the tactical situation that you have. We wouldn't want someone to make a suicidal plunge into enemy fire if there wasn't a chance that it would be successful, right? So if there's an opportunity for certain people to escape the threat, then we'd certainly want them to take advantage of that. But there does come a time in these incidents where there is no other option other than fighting. And unfortunately, what we've seen is a narrative take hold in our culture where the fighting is no longer considered to be a worthy option. And that's something that we want to outsource to other people. We want to outsource responsibility for fighting that fight to our police or to our military, or somebody else does that for me. And so there's no longer that personal responsibility in our culture where you are the one that is responsible for ensuring your personal safety. So I think a healthy dose of that narrative that you're preaching is very important to us right now, because we're lacking that in our society.
Yeah, well, of course, we're outsourcing it to the very people who they just, reiterated in the courts don't have a responsibility to protect you. So,
absolutely.
There you go. Now, let's talk about how all of this is impacting police recruiting. Tell me about that.
Yeah, police recruiting has taken a terrible hit here in recent years in particular, and we've seen this cycle come and go throughout law enforcement's history, but right now we're really seeing a low. The Police Executive Research Foundation recently did a study of 400 different agencies across the United States, and they found that upwards of about 66% of them are reporting that they have diminished strength and that they're having a hard time filling vacancies in their agencies. Anecdotally, talking to agencies across the U.S., anywhere from Seattle to Nashville, we're seeing anywhere from 50 to 80% less applicants show up for testing. And many of those applicants that do show up for testing are completely unqualified. We're seeing less applicants actually successfully pass the background check and the testing, the physical testing that's required to become a police officer. And so we're seeing less people show up, and of the people that do show up, we're seeing more of them that are unqualified for the job. And so there's a very big concern that we're going to have a critical shortage of police officers in the United States, particularly qualified ones.
So what would you say are the biggest reasons for that decline?
Well, some of the traditional ones that are argued are things like low pay, for example. In many parts of the United States, the police officer's salary just doesn't keep up competitively with the cost of living in their area. And so that's certainly a major factor. But my personal view is that I think this war on cops that we've seen over the last couple of years is the primary determinant right there. Mm-hmm. Because let's face it, cops have always been paid relatively low. It's never been a career where you're going to get rich. It's never been a career where they were paid probably what they were worth. But they had a strong spirit, a strong morale within the profession, where they thought it was a worthy profession, something that they were proud of doing. They had the respect of the public, and so some of those things helped to offset that low pay. But now with this war on cops, I think there's a lot of people that are taking a look at the profession, and they're saying, I'm not going to be supported by the public. Potentially, I'm going to be thrown in jail for just doing my job. There's a huge risk of personal safety with the increase in ambush attacks on officers, and it's just not worth it for the pay. And so it's discouraging a lot of people from coming into the profession.
Yeah, it seems like that. Now, this is the Hot Zone podcast, so I want to talk to you about hot zones in the United States and how that relates to maybe the philosophy of the police there. So you take a place like San Francisco, for example, where they've decided not to prosecute people for property crimes. And so we've seen this enormous spike in property crimes, but it also brings violent crime and other things along with it. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the voters are going to get the type of safety that they vote for. And so in a place like San Francisco, where they have continually tried to defund the police and put restrictions on them, they're going to get a community that's going to be less safe. And San Francisco is a wonderful example because recently they just came out with a policy that officers were prohibited from sitting suspects down when they were interviewing them in the field. That's a basic officer safety practice that officers do to put somebody at a disadvantage so that they can't launch a sudden attack on them. And so their police chief has decided that that's no longer an appropriate tactic for their officers because he thinks it's demeaning to the individual. So now officers are being forced to interview suspects when they're standing there, and they have a much greater risk of being a potential threat to the officer. So we've got policies like that. We've also got policies in San Francisco where they've had a massive revamp of their use of force policy, where officers are no longer allowed to fire at a moving vehicle, for example, unless that particular driver is firing a weapon at them. Well, the vehicle itself can be used as a weapon against an officer, and there are times when it would be justified to shoot at a moving vehicle, but the policies prohibit that. San Francisco also went through a huge episode recently with the authorization of tasers. Their officers didn't have the authorization to use tasers prior, and so they went through a big gut-wrenching proposition to go ahead and get those tasers approved for the officers, but they put significant restrictions on their use. And to the point that in some cases the taser would be not a beneficial tool for the officer to consider because of all the restrictions that he has to face.
Right.
So,
right. You get the perpetrator to fill out a consent form first before you use a taser or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So the voters get the police that they deserve, and if they're going to be willing to have these kinds of restrictions placed on their officers, and if they're willing to vote these kinds of policies into place, unfortunately, they're going to pay the price in an increase in crime, and particularly violent crime.
Yeah, that's true. Well, Mike, we're out of time, but thank you so much. It's really great to get your perspective on this kind of thing because that's your world, and I hope we can get you on again sometime. So thanks for being here.
Thanks, Chuck. It's always a pleasure.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.